Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, science writer and educator Chris Rutkowski steps into the vault. We explore Canada's more than 4-decade effort investigating the UFO phenomenon, and how Chris became the go-to guy that Canada called on to investigate modern-day sightings.
Pilots do see UFOs, that mariners do see UFOs, and that some of them, do need to be examined in some detail. I'm not foolish to think that there isn't any cover-up regarding this at all. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Air Force both concluded in their investigation of the case that it could not be sufficiently explained.
And later, past guest Christopher O'Brien comes back to the show to announce his high-tech project that collects data and searches the skies for the ever-elusive UFO phenomenon.
And so you literally have an autonomous system that is able to detect and document scientifically a real-time UFO event.
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey, my quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is the Black Vault Radio. I am your host, John Greenewald Jr. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and making this your podcast and radio show of choice, at least for the next couple of hours anyway. It's a pretty exciting episode because I am introducing a new segment. The show is kind of structured with different segments. First, obviously, I start with an introduction, which is what you're listening to now. I'll deal with some headlines in the TBV News segment. The main brunt of the show is the TBV Dialogue segment. That's the interview portion where I bring in a guest and just pick their brain for at least an hour, if not more. And the TBV Unredacted segment, that's where I dissect documents, just pull something at somewhat random. Sometimes I try and put it to the theme of the show. Sometimes it just is something I choose at random. So there's really kind of no rhyme or reason. Just a document that I feel should be profiled. With 2 million pages in the archive, sometimes things get lost. So that's an opportunity for me to kind of bring them back to the surface, talk to you a little bit about them. That being said, this episode I'm introducing TBV Updates. Now, this is not going to be every show, but what this is where I now, as we reach the 13th episode, which is what you're listening to now, lucky number 13, we've got quite a few hours to listen to. I think I've produced over 25 hours of content that you can download all for free. And in that 25 hours, we've now listened to quite a few guests. Well, although I will bring guests back for the normal dialogue segment, sometimes guests will have some kind of an update. Maybe they'll tease something on the show, or maybe they'll say, we're about to do this, but it hasn't launched yet, or 1,000 different reasons why we would want to bring them back, maybe not necessarily for a full interview, but rather an update. Well, that is the case in this episode. TBV Updates will be coming up a little bit later in the show, but I am bringing back Christopher O'Brien. Now, Christopher O'Brien is the expert. He is the one in the field investigating quite a few different aspects of the paranormal, but one in particular that we chatted about was the phenomenon known as animal mutilations or cattle mutilations. And so we really dissected a lot of what he has investigated in the past and what he has found out and researched. I have a lot of respect for him and his approach. That was back in episode number 7. So if you didn't listen to that interview, I recommend after you listen to this one, go back into the archives, listen to episode number 7. It's well worth it because he does bring a lot of cases to the table, information to the table. So make sure that after you listen to this episode, go back, listen to episode number 7, see what he has to say, because there's a lot of it and a lot of great information. Well, he's coming back to update us on a project that he just started, something really exciting in the field of UFOs, a little bit different than animal mutilations. Some argue there's a connection. We'll let you decide that one. But he has developed a system that brings together computers, software, cameras, and by planting them in certain areas of the planet, I mean, the goal is as many stations as you can, these stations will actually communicate with each other, figure out when there is a UFO sighting of some kind, and then as the systems get the record that there's some kind of UFO in the sky, they can actually move themselves, as they're all on movable tripods, move themselves and, in essence, zero in that particular region of the sky and maybe cross-triangulate, take different readings, and so on. It's a very cool and very exciting system and very elaborate. It's something that I'm surprised has never been done before, but Chris is back to talk about that. Also in the show, Chris Rutkowski, he's a researcher, UFO researcher from Canada, and we are talking about the Canadian UFO connection, and he's really the guy. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. He's the man when it comes to Canadian UFO reports. He has worked with the Canadian government when they stopped their official investigations, that he became the guy where they would pass on these UFO reports to. So he's going to be joining me talking about documents, his case file research, and a massive database that he has compiled of UFO sightings. We're going to dig into all of that. Now, before we get into some headlines, I want to talk to you guys about something that, although is a couple weeks old now, and if you've been watching the Black Vault on social media, you will notice a UFO case that literally went viral. This was a case that we posted a few weeks ago, maybe close to a month now. And what's interesting about it is, number one, it's not available anywhere else. Now, it was essentially stolen by quite a few different YouTube channels that never asked. A few did ask, and I did give permission for a few. Most of them just kind of took it and didn't even give credit. But this video came across my desk from a friend of mine, and although it's a friend of a friend situation, we ended up interviewing the witness, but that's kind of how I became aware of it. And she wrote to me and said, hey, a friend of mine who's not really into UFOs and not out UFO hunting was an amateur photographer and videographer, and he set up a camera and was videotaping the moon. And as he's watching the moon, he films multiple UFOs that seemingly cross in front of the moon from his vantage point, in between the moon and his vantage point, and just kind of slowly fly across. Now, normally, gut reactions just say, okay, that's probably cool on the surface, but when you actually investigate it, it could be one of a couple things. Satellites, birds, balloons, something to that effect. So what we did was we got the original high-definition, unedited, untweaked, uncropped, uneverything video straight from his camera. The TBV Investigations crew, which I've mentioned here a couple times on the show, but if this is your first time listening, TBV Investigations is a group of researchers and investigators that are helping me tackle the cases just like this that come into the Black Vault. Before I assembled the team, I would literally just kind of get the UFO report or other aspects of the paranormal also, but UFOs are very common since that is a very popular topic on the Black Vault. And I would archive them, but there was no way that I can actually research each and every one. So I assembled this team. It's an amazing group of people, very eclectic, different backgrounds, ex-law enforcement, current law enforcement even, ex-military, an amazing group of people that put their minds to really logically look at these cases and try and figure it out. So we looked at this one, and in fact, the lead investigator, Monica Salazar, she was the one that really kind of put together the main report and the main investigation. But because of the interest that this video was getting, not only from me, but kind of the team, I brought a couple other investigators that were part of the TBV Investigations crew to look at this thing. To my surprise, we couldn't really easily debunk it. The birds, the balloons, the satellites all started to fall one by one. Now, we published this thing. I'm going to link it in the show notes, theblackvault.com/show notes. That will get you access to that case file. We published this thing, and yeah, we expected quite a bit of attention to it just because of the nature of it. Never did we realize it would truly go viral. It was published in multiple newspapers. Again, people from various YouTube channels were stealing it. Even the hacker group Anonymous grabbed it, looked at it, couldn't figure it out, created an article, and blasted it out to their 10 million, literally 10 million Facebook followers alone. And again, they couldn't figure this thing out. Well, kind of fast forward a couple weeks. I received a letter from someone who was incredibly intelligent with math. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't even claim to try and understand the mathematical formulas that he has put together. He wrote to me and he said, I saw this posted in a forum. Somebody wanted me to essentially debunk it, I think it was, or at least comment on it. And so he put together some mathematical formulas, measured the object, measured the moon, figured out the time of night that the moon was seen in the sky in Italy, calculated the percentage up in the horizon. I mean, this guy went to an amazing length to calculate potentially speed and size. Now, although I'm going to say this up front, and I think we all can agree, even this new member of the TBV Investigations team, the calculations are not necessarily hardcore to the centimeter accurate, but rather I believe what he's trying to do is start to plug in certain things and try and dismiss these objects as birds or as balloons or as whatever. And he can't do it. The reason is because after he put together these scientific formulas and mathematical calculations and so on, and he plugged in the variables, there's a particular bird that flies at 37,000 feet. That's the record. It's the highest flying bird. It's called a griffon vulture. He plugged in kind of the information for the griffon vulture and realized that there is no possible way that this could account for what is seen in the video. For example, one of his conclusions is that if it was a griffon vulture in migration and they were that high, they would actually, based on the size of the objects or the UFOs that are seen, they would have to be 156,000 feet away from the camera. And that would essentially be about 78,000 feet in elevation. And his calculation took, again, into consideration the angle that the moon was in. So 156,000 feet away from the camera is roughly 78,000 feet above ground. Yes, if this sounds complicated, it really is. I worked quite a bit behind the scenes with him to really try and figure out the math. He obviously gets it. Right, his name is Joseph Miller, Joey Miller, and Mr. Miller did an amazing job really spelling this out. And we're inviting others to look at this mathematical formula and really try and challenge it, so to speak. I mean, he's not saying that this is a complete documented gospel, but rather it does make sense, even for me who doesn't understand math. And I'll be honest with you, I did not do well in math at school. When I was in school. So, it's hard to really grasp the formulas, but he explains it all, shows the calculation, shows the variables, shows how he did it, and then he starts dismissing things. So again, those griffon vultures would have to be 78,000 feet above ground. That's not even possible. No bird flies that high. He also was able to calculate a speed going greater than 72 miles an hour. Again, approximate, but he spells out why he came up with that. That's also way too fast for birds. He also goes into detail on why we can rule out small insects and those at close distances. And this is what I will say, because I believe that this will be the most common, because I haven't published this yet. But by the time you're listening to this, it will be published. And so it's going to be published the same day as this episode. And when you download it and you see what he's done, I believe that the most popular skeptical reaction to all of this will be, well, the birds are a lot lower in altitude. So they're still birds, but they're much lower than altitude. There's a site called Metabunk. And although I do have respect for those guys and gals, because they really do work very hard on investigating cases, and they do mathematical formulas such as this, and they try and dismiss things. And, well, a site called Metabunk, you can only imagine what the final product usually is, which is some kind of a debunking tactic. They as well were made aware of this case, and they tried to debunk it. They went from birds, then they went to balloons, and I think they kind of debated for a while, and then I think they've settled on balloons. Well, the problem with all of that, and we go into great detail, the problem with all of that is something that is much lower to the ground, based on this vantage point, would be flying much faster through the frame. So again, when you watch this video and you see the breakdown of birds and balloons and the scientific calculations and this and that, you'll realize, just based on pure common sense, when you look at videos of the moon and a bird flies by, they jam through really fast. Why? Because they're much closer to the ground. So when you think like a camera lens, and that camera lens is zoomed way into the moon, and a bird flies through, that bird is real close to the camera. So two things are going to happen. It's going to be real blurry, or if it does get captured enough, if it's at a height that it's not completely out of focus, it really shoots through that frame. So it's like, oh, wait, you can't even say bird fast enough. It's already gone. These UFOs in this video move very, very slowly through the frame. With the focal length of the camera, you can deduce they are fairly far away, and that's the conclusion we came up with. Along comes Joey Miller. He joins the team. He creates a mathematical breakdown. Not only really kind of coincides with our conclusions, which I'll admit was a little bit more conjecture, just simply because we didn't do this complicated math. Not everybody can do this. When you see it, you'll get what I mean. But he pretty much concluded kind of the same thing we did, which was objects much closer, they're going to be way out of focus, or just kind of go through the frame much faster. Birds, no way, because these objects are calculated at much higher. Insects close to the camera, no way, because you'd have high blur, or it just doesn't fit the calculation. So why am I going off on a tangent like this? I think it's really important. One of the members of our team, not to call him out, but he was also ex-law enforcement, and he was the one, I think, in our team that really started looking at the bird theory first. And although it made sense, we could not prove it. And we have been able to prove and debunk certain cases that have come in our way. In fact, a lot of them we can find very reasonable explanations, and some of which are undeniable. Others are very, very likely, but we label the cases as such, where we say, we think it might be this, but we need more evidence, or this is definitely this because here's proof. This is something we just could not do. The addition to Joey Miller onto our team and his calculations really drives it home. This is a pretty amazing video, and one that is not as easily as debunked as some people want to believe. That being said, make sure you check out those show notes, www.theblackvault.com/show notes. By the time you're listening to this, all of those calculations will be published. I'm only bringing up the fact that it hasn't been published yet simply because I don't know what the reaction's going to be. So maybe next episode I'll go ahead and dive deep into some of those reactions and some of those skeptical insults that are probably going to be thrown our way, and how wrong we really are. But at the end of the day, we just cannot debunk this video. So I wanted to bring it up, especially on an episode with Chris Rutkowski, when we are talking about all things UFOs. I figured it was a good fit. That being said, before we bring that Chris number 1 onto the show, and then later we'll be rejoined by Christopher O'Brien and giving us that TBV update. Before we get to all of that, we're going to deal with some headlines on TBV News. In this episode's TBV News segment, I like to bring up a few headlines that you may or may not have missed since our last episode. And I want to start with a little bit of an update, or at least kind of an addition to a story that I believe was on last episode's segment on TBV News, which was all about a Japanese spacecraft called the Hayabusa 2. Now, there was a pair of robots that was on board this spacecraft that actually landed on a small asteroid that they called Ryugu. Sorry if I have that pronounced incorrectly. But these two robots had landed on the surface, released some pretty amazing photographs. If you haven't seen them, I'll link the show notes page again to this article. But, I talked about it a little bit more in length on the last episode. Now, there was another mission that was back in approximately 2014 from the European Space Agency. This was the Rosetta mission. Now, if you weren't watching the news around this actually for me was fairly exciting because they had landed a probe or lander onto the surface of a comet, which I won't even pretend that I know the correct way to pronounce, but I'll go ahead and link it in the show notes page. But the Rosetta mission had successfully landed on this comet and took some extraordinary pictures. Now, the story, in my opinion, just kind of died after that. Now, it was an amazing story, made great headlines. The photographs were extraordinary back in 2014. Well, what was fairly interesting to note was that the spacecraft, the Rosetta mission, the main spacecraft that held that lander, stayed in orbit around the comet. And it continued to kind of do some scientific readings and take photographs. But in 2016, approximately 2 years after that lander had sat on the surface, the Rosetta spacecraft was crashed into the comet. On approach, it continued to take photographs. And one of the last photographs that it took was actually just released in the last week or two. It's an amazing look at the surface of literally an alien world. I mean, yes, it's a comet, but when you look at this thing, it's like if you were taking a hike in the middle of Arizona or, California desert or something like that. It looks like there's snow-capped or ice-capped, I should say, mountain ranges. At least that's what it appears here. Some amazing detail on the rock formations, but the clarity is just phenomenal. I mean, it really is an amazing thing to see. Now, I don't know if the ESA or the European Space Agency just kind of got a little bit jealous over the recent news that the Japanese mission was getting, but they released this photograph here just in the last week or two. Definitely worth checking out because, again, you don't see this every day. It's not every day that you see literally the surface of a comet. When we think of a comet, we think of night sky photographs, something that you see from maybe a telescope, but it's a very blurry ball of burning something rather, and you kind of got to squint and tilt your head and you go, oh yeah, it's a comet. This is pretty amazing. Like I said, it's like you take a beautiful DSLR camera onto a hike and you take a picture of a desert rock formation or something like that. That's the quality of these things. So you got to see those photographs. I love when these space agencies from various countries get into kind of these, they don't say it, but in my impression, they get in like these battles and they continue to try and outdo each other. And yes, some of the agencies join hands and do collaborative missions and so on and so forth. But in my opinion, this is kind of like a prime example of that friendly butting heads. We got to outdo the other one, because when the Hayabusa 2 then had a successful mission, all of a sudden the ESA says, "Oh yeah, well look at this," and release the photograph. Something that I love. I love those little space race battles. It's kind of why I've been fairly outspoken, although I won't go on a tangent here, about the commercialization of space travel and space exploration. There's a difference between governments doing it largely motivated by science and passion, and even though I'm not saying that it does not occur in the private sector, there's obviously much different reasonings for why they do what they do. That being said, though, again, it's a tangent for a different show. I just wanted to bring up those photographs, something to definitely take a look at. Sticking with space, because I love these headlines. You never really see them. This just coming in the last couple of days. There is now a new discovery around the exoplanet Kepler 1625b. Now, for those who don't follow this, we have multiple missions up, including the Kepler telescope and the Hubble Space Telescope and so on. And they all look for exoplanets. Those are planets outside of our solar system. And contrary to what scientists believed many, many years ago, the universe is teeming with exoplanets. In fact, it's like every star that they have the capability of zeroing in on, they're seeing these exoplanets. So it's like every star, when you go out in the night and you go out and you look up and you see those stars, it's now starting to be believed that most of what you are seeing, including most of what you don't see when it comes to the stars in the sky, all have exoplanets of some kind around them. Here's the other interesting discovery, and I've interviewed Dr. Jeffrey Marcy, who's kind of considered I'm not really sure the correct term that they've kind of labeled him, but he's really kind of the godfather of exoplanet exploration. He, the last time I checked anyway, had discovered more exoplanets than any other scientist out there. And I got to interview him when I was producing a Discovery Channel documentary. And wow, is it just amazing to sit down with these brilliant minds and hear their discoveries and their ideas and what they're pushing towards and so on. So with these discoveries, they're also realizing that a lot of these planets are what they call Earth-like planets. These are planets that have a very high probability of having life. Now, of course, scientists quickly shoot down that notion saying, well, we've never found any signs of life. And if we do, or when we do, it will probably be microorganisms and this and that. Now, that's kind of a silly stance in my opinion, because if life is out there on a cellular level, it is immediately, I believe, deduced that life is out there on a super intelligence level. And that means that I do not believe that Earth is the only intelligent life out there. Scientists want you to believe that we were the first, and maybe cellular organisms on a 1 or 2 cell scale are in existence out there, but nothing more than that. To me, that's silly, because the moment we confirm beyond a doubt life is out there, even on a cellular microscopic level, I believe we can easily then conclude that there is intelligent life that would put us to shame, and we're considered fairly intelligent, although that is debatable. I think on a cosmic scale, we would find somebody much, much more intelligent the moment we discover that life, again, even on that molecular scale, is out there. That being said, though, as they discover all of these exoplanets, they're now starting to make even more discoveries. One, again, by Kepler 1625b, they believe 8,000 light years away, which is where this planet is, they have found the first orbiting moon of an exoplanet. So now they're really seeing a lot of these discoveries. They're seeing these similarities to what we have right here on Earth. Now, look at how many stars there are in the sky. Now, we've only looked at, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent, and we're making all of these discoveries, all of these Earth-like planets, all of these situations, which are very, very similar to here on Earth. And now they're finding moons. This one is about the size of Neptune. They believe the moon is the size of Neptune. That's a fairly large moon, which means Kepler 1625b is fairly large to have a moon of that size. But that being said, life can exist on any sized planet. Not to bring up television again, but one of the shows, and I believe this was the one that I interviewed Dr. Jeffrey Marcy for, was a show that I had created for History Channel, which was part of their series called The Universe. And this was called Alien Faces. And if it was, the premise was, if there was life in the universe, what would it look like? And I had to create a documentary based on that, using all science, no fringe stuff, no abduction stories, no I had a contact with an alien, nothing like that. Purely scientific. If certain life forms were out there, what would they look like? And so we dealt with, I created a hypothetical chunk of the universe. It was the hardest show I've ever done. hypothetical chunk of the universe with different planets varying in size, atmosphere, distance from the sun, so on and so forth. And all of those aspects and characteristics played a role into how life had formed. Now, Dr. Jeffrey Marcy was just one of quite a few that were in this show. I got to interview Dr. Michio Kaku. I got to interview Dr. Seth Shostak from SETI, David Aguilar from Harvard University, who I believe is now actually working on various space missions outside of Harvard, at least the last time I checked. All of these men and women that I got to interview were so brilliant and so amazing to listen to. And when you hear how essentially easy it is for life to exist, these types of discoveries, we need to pay attention to them. We need to hear about them more. The politics have just invaded and infested our nightly news. And although that is important and is a topic of interest, at least for me, I think we need to bring down the percentage of that coverage a little bit and deal with these types of amazing discoveries. So that's why I bring some of these up and kind of geek out on you a little bit during this segment when those types of discoveries are made, because I think they should be profiled. The last one, if you did not get it, or at least maybe you were sleeping through it, there was a presidential alert that went out this week on our cell phones. This is actually a new system which is called the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, or IPAWS. That's at least according to FEMA anyway. Now, we know that there's other systems out there to alert us about kidnappings, what they call Amber Alerts. I know those aren't fully nationwide, at least I don't think so, but quite a few states have adopted the Amber Alerts. There's other types of alerts. Those are all able to access your phone and give you some kind of a text message. This is a little bit different. This comes from the President of the United States. And they actually started the design of this. This is not as well known, but they actually conceived the idea back in 2005 during the presidency of George W. Bush. It has taken this long for them to actually implement the system, and this week they actually tested it. I got the alert. Many of my friends and colleagues were posting about it and taking screenshots. Some were prepared for it. Others were wondering what the heck it was. No, it is not a new President Trump direct tweet system to you, but rather this is used to alert us of any particular type of presidential message that he feels he needs to get across. It didn't really bother me at all. A lot of people were freaking out about privacy and wanting to turn it off and anti-President Trump and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle is going to send a presidential alert test. It is what it is, Here's what's interesting, though, on why I bring this up. The text message said the following, quote, "Presidential alert. This is a test of the National Wireless Emergency Alert System. No action is needed," unquote. That was the message we all got, or at least most of us got. It actually totaled 225 million people actually were set to receive that message. Now, the interesting part of this, albeit very controversial, is the cyber expert John McAfee. Now, you may not know who he is, but you probably recognize McAfee as the virus protection software and the security software suite that you can install on your computer. Really, really popular quite a few years ago. Not as much anymore since there's a lot of free things that are now out. But John McAfee, who is no stranger to controversy, chimed in about this new presidential alert system. Here's his tweet that has gained a lot of traction in the last day or two since this presidential alert went to 225 million Americans. He tweeted out, John McAfee tweeted out, "The presidential alerts, they are capable of accessing the E911 chip in your phones, giving them full access to your location, microphone, camera, and every function of your phone. This not a rant." I assume he means this is not a rant. "This not a rant. This is from me, still one of the leading cybersecurity experts. Wake up, people." That was his tweet. Now, obviously, this is fairly controversial just simply because it's John McAfee. John McAfee's, again, no stranger to making some strange and wild claims. I actually looked up this part. He literally said that he would eat a part of himself. I won't tell you what part because I don't want to put an explicit label on this for iTunes, but he said that he would eat part of himself if Bitcoin was not hundreds of thousands of dollars per coin by the year 2020. Now, again, these types of tweets and claims and statements don't do his credibility any good, especially when he had pretty much endorsed Vermin Supreme. Do you know who that guy is? That's the guy that runs around and wants to be the libertarian nominee and later presidential top contender and ultimately become president, that wears the boot on his head. He wears camouflage. He's a pretty crazy looking guy, crazy with how he talks as well. And he's got a little bit of a cult following just simply because, he runs around with a rubber boot on his head and wants to be president of the United States. That being said, John McAfee also said that he would be the, quote, best president ever. He tweeted that out on October 2nd of this year. Okay, so this guy obviously sends out some pretty crazy stuff. Well, no one denies, though, his expertise when it comes to some of these cybersecurity issues. My concern is whether or not this is accurate or not, and I can't verify it. So I'm bringing it up in the TBV news segment to kind of keep you updated on this. Went a little bit farther than the presidential alert. I think that it's a little bit silly that John McAfee chimed in, but I'm wondering if there is truth to it. But keep in mind, many of the apps that we use get access to our camera and microphone and so on and so forth. So it's kind of silly, from a common sense standpoint, that the government would need to hide a spying program within a presidential alert system. All they have to do is create a game. They have to create some kind of addictive game that millions of people will install on their phones, get access to microphones and cameras, which, let's face it, I don't care when an app says, hey, this app wants to access your camera, is that okay? Or your microphone, is that okay? Generally, I'll push yes. Not all the time. Generally, I'll push yes. That's what they need to do. They need to make an addictive tic-tac-toe game. They don't need to make this presidential alert system. Therefore, you've got access then to millions and millions of Americans that would install such an app. Granted, it's not the 255 million people that received, or 225, I should say, million people that would receive this mass text. But let's face it. Why create such a spy program in that type of a system when you have multiple other ways to do it? And I just don't quite understand that logic. But that being said, John McAfee sent that out, obviously gaining traction as I record this show, and something to pay attention to, because my guess is his tweet is going to create quite a bit of controversy as we go on, maybe even see another presidential alert. Who knows when, maybe in the coming weeks or months, who knows? Hopefully we won't need to, because I believe it is made for an emergency broadcast situation where, let's say, a war breaks out or some kind of natural disaster or so on. But at least the system is in place and it's working. Now, of course, given any type of acceleration of technology like that, along come the conspiracy theories, and I cannot, at least by the recording of this show, I can't verify that system truly does access the E911 chip in all of our phones, mine included. I can't verify that. If you guys can, let me know. I'd love to kind of update and say, well, John McAfee is just kind of crazy and there's no substantiation for this, or if this is something that's documented, because again, by the time I've been recording this is fairly new. This is something that is within the last 24 hours. And although people have been reporting what McAfee said, I have not seen evidence that it's actually true. I'd love your help figuring that out. I'll update everyone on a future show. That being said, now it's time for Chris Rutkowski in the TBV Dialogue segment, and stay tuned after that. The new TBV Updates segment is also coming your way with an interview, shorter interview, but an interview nonetheless, with our friend of the show, Christopher O'Brien, updating us on a brand new, very cool, very elaborate system that he's involved with. Stay tuned. In this episode's TBV Dialogue segment, I welcome science writer and educator Chris Rutkowski into the vault. Since the mid-1970s, Chris has been studying reports of UFOs and writing about his investigations and research. He has 10 published books on UFOs and related issues. Some of the titles include Unnatural History, Abductions and Aliens, A World of UFOs, I Saw It Too, The Big Book of UFOs, and most recently, he's published When They Appeared, and that came out in 2017. He's appeared in numerous radio programs, podcasts, and documentary television series, including Unsolved Mysteries, UFO Hunters, Sightings, Discovery Channel's Close Encounters, and A&E's The Unexplained. He is the past president of the Winnipeg Science Fiction Society, Manitoba Writers Guild, and the Winnipeg Centre of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. Now, that's what I call a resume. Chris, welcome to the Black Vault Radio.
Oh, glad to be here, John. Yeah, I slack off a bit here and there, but that's how it is.
Do you do anything, or do you just lounge on the couch all day?
Yeah, Netflix binging is my thing. So
yeah,
there you go.
Well, looks like it. Well, you've got an amazing resume there. I have known you for quite some time now, and I got to tell you, you definitely are on the top of my list when it comes to researchers. And just so the audience is aware of your background, I'm going to let you kind of explain it. But just to kind of add my 2 cents, Chris really has a very no-nonsense approach. And he's not one that really buys into, this is my impression anyway, buys into anything that crosses his desk. He is a researcher in the true sense of the word. He looks into those claims. Chris, let me pass it to you. You said, or I said in the introduction, that you've been doing this since about the mid-1970s. How did you get started, and why? What were you trying to find?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm really that old. Starting back in the 70s. Back in the mid 70s, there were a fair number of UFO reports coming out of Manitoba and Canada in particular, and I was curious about it. I was reading as much as I could. I was in high school and first year university. I got into astronomy. I was taking my astronomy degree, and UFO reports were coming into the astronomy department, and my professors, in their esteemed positions, had been telling us that UFOs were nonsense, except the reports kept coming in, and they were getting a little concerned that they were spending so much time talking to people about what they had seen that they couldn't spend enough time working on their serious research. So I've said, why don't I take the reports for you? I'm just my office is just down the hallway. As soon as a call comes in, let me know, and I'll dash and talk to the people for you. I mean, trying to get in good with the profs is number one in university, of course. And so I started taking the phone calls from people who had been seeing UFOs, and it didn't take very long before I realized 2 things. Number one, most of the reports that I was getting could easily be explained. Mm-hmm. The second part was that there were some reports that I couldn't explain, and the people reporting them didn't seem to be crazy or nutty or hallucinating or any of that. And I spent some time wondering about this, and I went off into the countryside because they were coming in from rural areas from all across the region, and spending time talking with people and listening to them share their stories with me. And I was just genuinely puzzled by some of the cases that didn't seem to be airplanes and stars and bolides and all that sort of stuff. So I just was curious. And then at one point, I guess about a year later, the astronomy department with the physics department was having these regular Friday afternoon departmental meetings where anybody could present, and usually it's always presented by a doctoral candidate or a researcher or a prof, one of the faculty members. But somebody had canceled at the last minute, and I was asked by my professor, would I mind explaining what I had heard from all these UFO witnesses? Mm-hmm. So I said, sure. A little odd for an undergraduate student to give a presentation. So I was going to be giving the presentation in the usual meeting room, and my prof stopped me and said, you know what? Words got around that you're going to be speaking about UFOs, so we have to move you to the largest lecture hall on campus. So I found myself that afternoon speaking before 500 people, and there were TV cameras, and it got quite a lot of attention because I was talking about UFOs at a university, and that was quite remarkable at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of a baptism by fire, because I soon found myself the recipient of a lot of UFO reports, questions, media interest, that type of thing. Soon I began writing about what I had heard. People said you should write a book, so I started writing articles and books, and being called upon to give expert comment on a few things. And that was sort of how I got into the UFO thing. And my goal really wasn't to prove anything. I really wanted to share information, but from a scientific point, that I wanted to understand what people were seeing, and whether they were aliens from outer space or fireballs, chunks of comets. That could be shaken out of the data. But I wanted to understand what it was that people were seeing.
In the United States, in the mid-1970s, the UFO investigation had kind of stopped, and we've talked about it here on the Black Vault Radio quite a bit, of how it was pre-1969 and how it was after. I haven't really specifically pointed it out yet, but you're obviously from Canada, if those listening haven't caught on yet. And being in Canada, can you kind of compare what the aura was around the topic in Canada versus the United States, or was it kind of the same?
Well, from a media standpoint, it was very much related. But in terms of government interest, Canada took a slightly different path. I mean, there was a lot of cooperation between Canada and the United States, shades of U.S. MCA. But there was the relationship was very strong, in the sense that cases in Canada were often investigated by the United States Air Force,
mm-hmm.
So there was some Canadian investigation that was shared with the United States to a certain degree, especially regarding NORAD, for example. But what happened was that even though Blue Book kind of died around 69, the Canadian side continued to investigate. In fact, there were parallel Canadian UFO projects. There was Project Second Story and Project Magnet, which were going on in the 50s and 60s. And things continued to be investigated, because what happened was that there was an interest by the astronomers in the National Research Centre, National Research Council, rather, of Canada,
mm-hmm.
where it was realized that some meteorites that fall to Earth had been seen to fall and misidentified by witnesses as UFOs. So they said, well, perhaps we can get a national network of observations, and we can collect the observations of UFOs in the hope of actually finding new meteorites for scientific study. So the National Research Council of Canada worked with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and engaged the RCMP in investigating UFOs on their behalf, so that they could eventually pinpoint where a meteorite would have fallen and find the chunk of rock and iron on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So the RCMP in Canada were actually investigating UFOs beyond Blue Book right up until 1995.
Wow.
And so we actually have a complete record of the RCMP investigations, which actually were working in conjunction with the Royal Canadian Air Force and later the Canadian Forces. And the files were all available in the National Archives of Canada all this time. So there was no cover up. The disclosure wasn't needed, because the files were actually there. And my own interest was such that, as an astronomer, of course, I knew that this was occurring. And I had gone to Ottawa for meetings a number of times, and I went to the National Research Council of Canada office, where they were collecting UFOs and taking phone calls, and at that time telexes and faxes about UFOs from witnesses, not only civilians but also RCMP and military witnesses. And it actually happened that I was in the office when a report came in from my own city, and I took it back with me and ended up talking to the witness of the UFO the next day. So that continued until 1995. And we have all these records available. In fact, in the National Archives, because of the public interest in UFOs, actually digitized, many thousands. I think we're well into the 7,000 pages now of UFO reports during those periods. And it's fascinating to read some of those. And what happened after 1995 was that in that time, the Meteoritics Division of the National Research Council had, and not that they were winding down, but the researchers were moving on to other projects, and so they really didn't need people to search for those anymore. They were finding them through other ways, through sky cameras and whatnot. So that division actually closed. The RCMP responsibility in that regard was terminated, but the problem was that the UFO reports kept coming in. So they were looking around for someone to receive their UFO reports. And when I was in Ottawa in the 90s, I had been speaking to Peter Millman, who was had been involved in UFO investigations for Canada at the national level. And he was saying, we're getting out of the UFO business. Maybe we can find somebody to take over the collection of UFO reports. And I said, well, you can always send them directly to me. Mm-hmm. Never thinking that would actually happen. And in the year 2000, I started receiving the UFO reports that had been submitted to the National Research Council and through the RCMP and some Canadian Forces reports as well. So I've actually been receiving UFO reports ever since then, officially. And that actually was very good, because in 1989, actually, in 1988, I guess we had the meeting. I had a meeting across Canada of all the serious UFO researchers and investigators, because I was trying to understand how many UFO reports there really were. And, they were coming in regionally to small clubs and groups, and there were media reports, but we never had a good handle on how many reports there were, which province had the most. It would be like saying, are there more UFOs in Vermont than Maine, or in Montana than Florida? And what are the characteristics? Are there some differences between the reports themselves? So I wanted to know that, so I worked with my colleagues across Canada and produced the first Canadian UFO survey in 1989, finding that there were 141 reports had been filed across the nation in that particular year. And we worked hard to see if we can find additional reports the following year, expanding our envelope, so to speak. Contacting more groups. And by early 1990s, we had a fairly good handle on the number of UFOs that were being reported in Canada, and we were including the ones that were being reported officially through Transport Canada and the National Research Council and so forth. And that's kept it up. In fact, this coming year will be the 30th anniversary of the Canadian UFO survey, during which time we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 UFO reports that we've logged. Canada usually gets around 1,000 UFO reports each year, and these are reports that are filed through official agencies, through UFO groups, and directly to individuals like myself in the Canadian UFO report and Canadian UFO survey. And it gives us a perspective on how many are reported, what time of day. We can get perspectives on dates and calendar months, that type of thing, to understand, are there more green UFOs than red? What are the shapes associated? What's the time of day that's most likely? What are the characteristics, whether the types, nocturnal lights, daylight discs, and so forth. And we've actually had the Canadian UFO survey used as a model for other studies that have been done. And eventually, we're going to be using some of this data to give presentations. In fact, I already have given some presentations to scientific congresses to show this is what's really being reported. Despite what you may see or hear in tabloids, on popular websites, and so forth, this is the foundation of what all of ufology rests upon, because if it wasn't for the reports themselves, we wouldn't be able to say that, people are seeing things, obviously.
Yeah.
But this tells us what it is that people really are seeing. And there's some basic analyses that can be done. It turns out that there, in every year, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10-ish% are unexplained on a first pass. And after we go through and do some analyses in terms of strangeness and reliability and how much data there is, we can get this down to about 1 or 2% of all the cases each year that are what we call the high quality unknowns. And by that, we don't mean that these are alien spacecraft. We simply mean that these are cases that we don't really have a good handle on. They're not easily explained as stars and planets and so forth. And in speaking with some of the more ardent skeptics, like Tim Printy and Robert Schaefer, we can even winnow some of those down. In fact, Tim mentions this Canadian UFO survey every year and goes through some of the unexplains and can find explanations for a few more. So it's interesting to see that we can get down to the very basics simply by doing some honest research.
What's great is you make all of this data online available to everybody. If you are listening, want to check it out, an amazing amount of work has gone into what Chris has created with the Canadian UFO survey. You can log into the database, download the database, survey.canadianUFOreport.com. And of course, all the links that we're talking about are on the show notes page. If you're not sure how to get there, make sure you do so at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Not only will I link the Canadian UFO survey, Chris also has a great blog at uforum.blogspot.com. He's been blogging for many, many years. Lots of stuff to read there, so make sure you check that out. Chris, let me back you up just a little bit back to kind of your transition to be the guy in Canada to collect these reports. Here in America, as you very well know, but for those listening, we did about 21, 22 years of investigations in America. There were about 12,000 cases that they investigated during Project Blue Book. But after that, they closed it. They said they weren't interested, and that was it. The impression that I'm getting from Chris with his connection and the government doing research, which sounds like about twice that long, right, Chris? I mean, you said some of those earlier projects were, 1950s all the way through the 1990s. I mean, you're talking about 40 plus years. Is that accurate? Canada was doing 40 plus years of UFO investigation?
Absolutely. They did until at least 1995. And then since then, it's sort of been moved into the civilian realm. But sure, they're Canadian records. In fact, the National Archives has cases back into, I think in particular, the Project Project Magnet and Second Story. Those are from the 50s, let's say 52, 53, 54, somewhere in there. They're easily accessible. And I think that the archives contains the full set until somewhere in the 70s and early 80s, and then they're releasing even more, or they're digitizing even more. And we actually have all those cases anyways. And then after about 95, it becomes a different kettle of fish. But yeah, the investigation on behalf of the RCMP continued until 1995.
That's why I love doing this show, because I can, pick brains like yours that have been doing this for so long, and I learn things all the time. It's hard enough for me as an investigator to learn the American government. So to tackle another one has always been a little problematic for me. You obviously have done an amazing job doing an investigation for just 22 years with America. I've always been stuck on that, because if you can explain something away and you've got everything solved and so on, why waste taxpayer money and do it for 2 decades? Now in Canada, in the same type of research, they're doing it for twice as long. Are you telling me that the Canadian government is just as firm as the United States is of saying, well, we did this for decades and we found absolutely nothing? Is Canada the same exact way, or did they realize there was something more to this?
Well, there's 2 answers for that. One is, yes, they're really that firm, and they actually issued very similar statements, which you can find in the archives, along the same lines of the American government, that after a series of many years of investigations, nothing was found that was that showed that UFOs posed any threat to national security and so forth. So that type of verbiage is there. On the other hand, currently on the books, and I'm talking 2018, the Canadian Forces still has on its books what's called service instructions and Marint instructions. Mm-hmm. And the Marint instructions are actually the most interesting, because the Canadian Coast Guard has instructions for all mariners, civilian and military, that specifically say that if there's any mariner anywhere currently today who sees any object in the sky that is unidentified, and they actually spell it out very clearly in their manual, unidentified flying object, they are to report it immediately and for investigation. Now, that's currently on the books, mm-hmm. so that there's a directive from the Canadian government to investigate UFOs. Now, what happens to those, whether they are part of the set that I get every year or they go somewhere else, I'm not sure. And I don't think it's a matter of cover-up. I think it's just a matter of they are going somewhere, and we just haven't been able to determine that yet.
It's interesting you bring that up. I haven't really talked about it on this show. On the American side, service reports also exist. And mm-hmm. I'd done a lot of research on Air Force Instruction 10-206. Now, I won't take too much of the time, because I'm here to interview you and not tell too long of a story here. But the short of it was, I had discovered this manual in about the year 2000, 2001. United States Air Force, talk about service reports, spelled out unidentified flying objects. Now, when the Huffington Post, fast forward many years, when the Huffington Post was actually doing a story on the Black Vault, and I gave them kind of the top 5 documents, that was one of them. And to kind of quickly summarize the story, because this goes along the lines of what you just said and then leads into my next question. When a major media outlet was finally going to publicize this thing and profile it, literally 48 hours after the phone call from Lee Spiegel, who was on this show quite a few episodes ago. If you listening did not hear this, tune into that show, because we go into much more detail about this aspect. But the government covered it all up, deleted the whole chapter, claimed that they had no interest in UFOs. I'm able to document that they changed this thing, this manual, many times. UFOs always stayed in it. All of a sudden, the press wanted to profile it, and poof, it's gone. That leads to my next question. Is the Canadian government that blatant about covering up UFO reports? Or rather, it kind of seems like they're embracing people like you from the private sector, saying, hey, look, we did this for 40 years. Sure, we didn't find anything, but maybe somebody should still continue this. What is their mindset at?
Well, I think it's the latter. I don't think the Canadian government is trying to cover up anything. In that sense, I mean, I'm not foolish to think that there isn't any cover-up regarding this at all, and that everything is released to the public. In fact, I'm of the firm opinion that there's probably certain information that should not be released to the mm-hmm. public regarding sensitive information. You know, if there's missions that are underway when something is seen, that we probably don't need to know about that type of thing. But in terms of the UFOs, I think it's an honest admission that pilots do see UFOs, that mariners do see UFOs, and that some of them, do need to be examined in some detail. And whether this has something to do with sovereign rights in the North or in the Arctic or something like that, I'm not sure. But we've had some fairly good cooperation with the Canadian government, and my experience has been very positive.
I want to get into what you have uncovered as well, since you started the Canadian UFO Survey and kind of took over collecting reports in Canada. But before we do, I want to ask you, in 40 plus years, there has to be some gems in regards to cases that are just interesting and maybe even mind-blowing. I don't know. But obviously they continued their research for 40 plus years. They must have found something. Is there anything that sticks out to you during that time frame that the Canadian government just could not explain?
Well, yes, there are a number of cases. In fact, there's one case which is the basis for my most recent book, When They Appeared, regarding the Falcon Lake incident in 1967. I like talking about that case, and some people say, well, that's all Chris Rutkowski talks about, but there's a lot of cases out there. But I like this particular one because of a number of reasons. Number one, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Air Force both concluded in their investigation of the case that it could not be sufficiently explained. In the Condon report, which also looked at it, Roy Craig said that he found some inconsistencies in the information, and he had some concerns, and he said there was a line in there, something to the effect of, if the case could be proven as true, it would prove absolutely without a doubt that there would be alien spacecraft in our atmosphere. But he didn't buy it. And nevertheless, that the Canadians found, there was something a little more to the case. In fact, we have found within the archives and through other documentation more than 300 pages of documentation about the Falcon Lake case, where somebody, a man by the name of Stefan Mihalik, was actually physically injured by an encounter with a flying saucer type craft in the Canadian wilderness. He was examined by doctors. We have the medical records. The site was found, examined by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Forces, and there was radioactivity found at the site. His physical injuries persisted. The case was investigated in great detail over a number of years. In fact, a year after the event, he went back. He'd healed enough that he could go back and again found some material from the site. And that material is also radioactive. Material is, we hear a lot today about metamaterials and artifacts from UFOs. Well, this is an artifact that is still in our possession. The family still has the possession of this. It's a radioactive piece of high-quality silver, which has been tested by a number of laboratories. And it's a fascinating case, and one that has stood the test of time. Mr. Mihalik never said that he had encountered aliens and little green men and all that sort of stuff. He had thought that it was some sort of American secret flying craft. This was 1967, just previous to Apollo. So, he thought maybe this was a vertical takeoff, something or other that somebody was testing. It's a fascinating case, and it's fully documented and still very, very puzzling.
This is the one, you mentioned physical injuries. This is the one where he had like burn marks on his chest?
Yeah, he had first and second degree burns on his body. He was examined by a number of doctors. He even went down to the Mayo Clinic, and we have the Mayo Clinic records. In fact, we have the Mayo Clinic psychiatric record because he had a full workup. And the Mayo Clinic psychiatrist said that this is not a guy who makes up stories. When you look at this case and, compare it to, for example, Roswell, we have the admission that there was something at the site and that something happened, which you don't have in Roswell. We have a wealth of physical evidence and radiation, which you don't have at the site. The witness who actually saw something was available to speak to investigators and was grilled and interrogated at great length by military investigators. In fact, we have the transcripts of those investigations, which you don't have in Roswell. I don't know why people aren't more interested in this than Roswell, quite frankly.
It is an interesting case, and I want to bring you back to when you mentioned the piece. Did you mean that it was as in pure silver or silver in color, the piece of the UFO that you still have?
No, this is pure silver, like foundry quality silver. It's quite fascinating.
And what kind of analysis has been done on this? Obviously, it's radioactive, so there's one test.
So isotopic analysis has been done on the radioactive particles that are part of it. The silver was analyzed at the University of Chicago. It was analyzed by Atomic Energy of Canada. It was analyzed by a number of other. It was actually analyzed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Laboratory. It's silver. It's very, very curious.
The last question I'll ask you on that, and then we'll kind of move on. But where it was found, the area that it was found, let's just kind of dispel a myth. I mean, is there like a silver vein that runs through the area that they mined to death, and this could have just been found by chance and, being radioactive? I know that that's silly, but let's just kind of use some common sense here. How out of place was this thing?
Well, it actually was extremely out of place. There's a caveat there in that the reason that Mr. Mihalik was there is actually he was prospecting. He had actually staked some claims for some copper. In fact, when I was there, I've been there a number of times to the site, that you can visit it even today. But there's a beautiful quartz vein running right underneath the spot where this flying saucer had said to have landed. And of course, quartz is associated with some, precious metals. So Mr. Mihalik had actually staked some claims in the area a number of times. But this is clearly not anything of that quality. This is commercial grade silver, not like you would find from some ore. So it's very curious. And there's another connection in that I mentioned that you can go to the site now. Well, it's such that there are actually tours that you can take. So again, here's an analogy to Roswell. You have to get in by horseback because the terrain is very difficult, but you actually can go on a pack mule ride in. Not an easy ride, but you can get in by horse. It's very swampy and so forth. And the Canadian government further admitted that this is a fascinating case because just this year, the Canadian government released a commemorative coin that heralds this particular case. And the coin is actually pure silver itself, in the shape of an alien face, the classic Strieber gray. But it also comes with a black light that when you shine on the coin, the UFO shines a beam of light onto the ground, illuminating Mr. Mihalik's effigy.
That's pretty elaborate. That's cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's quite interesting. Oh, and further to add to that, just this past spring, I was with the Mr. Mihalik's son and his family at the world premiere of a chorale, kind of like a mini operetta about this that was produced here in Canada. So I'd say there's a lot of interest in this case.
Yeah, well, rightfully so. It is fairly fascinating. During the Project Blue Book years, a lot of the cases, they would put a definitive answer and explanation for a lot of these cases. Did Canada do the same thing?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Canadian Forces both said that this case could not be satisfactorily explained. But that's counter to what was mentioned in Roy Craig's note in the Condon report, where he said that he just refused to believe that this could not be unexplained.
Wow. What are some of the other cases that you've dug out of these files? And then we'll move on to your database as well.
Well, there's quite a few. I mean, there's a Shag Harbor is one that also dates from the same time period, where an object was seen to fall into the ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia. And it was actually investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Forces. In fact, there are documents that attest to that the Canadian Forces were so fascinated with what might have fallen into the ocean that they sent in a Navy dive crew in to try and find what was under the water. There are many witnesses. In fact, just this past summer, I was in Nova Scotia at their own little mini celebration of UFOs, and ended up speaking with some of the original witnesses from 1967 who were still deeply affected by what they had seen and experienced. And again, there's government documentation to this that describe what was seen. There had been objects seen by pilots in the hours previous. It's a fascinating series of cases that culminated in something supposedly falling into the ocean.
So after 40 plus years and these types of cases, and I'm sure you can probably keep going with those cases, but I want to move to your database too. they decide to kind of join hands with you and pass on these reports. You had mentioned earlier that there's still manuals or instructions on the books referencing surveys and unidentified flying objects and reports that are still on the books today. What do they do with those reports? Are those passed on just directly to you, or is there kind of another secret UFO research program that still goes on in conjunction with what you're doing?
Well, I suspect that there's another research program going on. What level it is, I'm not sure, whether it's secret or classified or so forth. I do know that I do get the reports. A lot of them are simply not even investigated, and that may shock some people, but most UFO reports, even by civilian organizations, are not investigated. Sometimes they'll simply get a note that there was a report at such and such a time seen in this particular region. Sometimes there's contact information, sometimes there's not, description of what was seen, and so forth. And it doesn't sound like much investigation is being done at all anymore, although certainly some cases do get investigated. A few years ago, there was a remarkable sighting by the crew of a commercial airliner that was flying between Ottawa and Toronto. And the pilot had to take evasive action because there was an object right in his flight path. In fact, it had to take such evasive action that some of the crew who had been standing up preparing for landing hit their heads and arms and had to be hospitalized. The case was discussed by Transport Canada, and a statement released by Transport Canada because there had been some speculation that this was perhaps a drone or a balloon or something to that effect. Transport Canada said it was not a drone, it was not a balloon, but they were not prepared to release what this was. So there's some investigations going on at a level that I'm not privy to. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we do hear about them. So it's not a complete blackout. Yeah. At the same time, it tells us that there is an active investigation going on of particular cases, but not all of them.
Interesting. So now let's get to the part where Canadian government reaches out to you. You've got this database. You say, give them to me. How did you approach now the government giving you these cases? And after 40 plus years, they're not willing to really give a definitive answer of, yes, there's a alien connection, or yes, this is all top secret American technology and they're coming over our borders and, testing their toys over here. How did you approach it in the beginning, and has that morphed over the years since you took over?
Well, as I mentioned, I was in Ottawa for a meeting, and I was speaking with one of the individuals involved about the UFO reports that were coming in, and I said I would, gladly accept them for mm-hmm. my own personal research. And I sort of left it at that. And it was 5 years later that I actually started getting the reports, and I started simply by adding them into the yearly collection of UFO reports that I was receiving from other UFO organizations like MUFON and UFO Info and groups like that. Because to me, they were just as valuable as data as any of the others. And in fact, because I wasn't really getting a lot of the investigative data from the military and government reports, some of the cases that were civilian were actually better investigated. So it's simply a matter of including them in the annual survey to give an overview to show that this is what people are reporting to various agencies. And there are a lot of parallels in types and characteristics of the UFOs. We get similar results in terms of how many are nocturnal lights, how many are in certain regions of the country as opposed to others, that type of thing. So they're you simply added in as data. To me, I don't see a lot of difference between the reports coming in through official channels and ones coming in through diligent UFO investigators from the civilian front.
One of the things in your database is something called physical trace cases. And just so the listeners know, I mean, you're not just cataloging lights in the sky and making a report. There are cases that literally have physical traces left behind. You obviously talked about the Falcon Lake incident, and the witness himself had physical burns and so on. Although rare, that isn't too uncommon in the sense that you have a big part of your database to these physical traces. Can you give us an overview of some of the trace cases that you then started collecting, and what exactly, again, for those listeners who aren't real familiar with the term, kind of go into some detail of what makes a physical trace evidence case?
Sure. Well, I can't hold a candle to the work of Ted Phillips, whose work I really admire in collecting physical trace cases. And it's simply material or objects left behind after a UFO has left. And those cases are actually very, very rare right now. There's a lot of interest in UFO artifacts that have been collected over the years. The trouble is, some of them, they don't have very good provenance. The witness may have passed them on to several people before they actually arrived in the hands of investigators. Sometimes they were collected without some good methodology. So there's a lot of problems associated with UFO artifacts and physical traces, but these range from everything from, burns on the ground or darkening of leaves to pieces of something left behind that are found later by witnesses, and they used to be relatively common in the 60s and into the 70s, and they ranged from large chunks that turned out to be pieces of satellites to smaller pieces that could have been literally anything. And they do exist in the physical trace catalogs. I worked with Jan Vidnay in Quebec to produce a physical trace catalog for Canada. It has hundreds and hundreds of reports, rings that were found on the ground. Most were not properly analyzed, but there have been tests that have been done on a number of cases. In fact, 1967 was a banner year because in Duhamel, Alberta, not too far from Calgary, the home of the famous Stampede, there was a fascinating discovery in a field that was investigated by the Canadian forces themselves. In fact, what it was the very first crop circle. It did not happen in England. They seem to have come from the colonies and moved back to England, if that was the case. But there were large rings in the ground, 35 feet in diameter or so, that were discovered. They were not associated with a visual sighting. But what's curious is that the case was investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Air Force, which also produced a report on physical traces associated with the UFO landing rings in Duhamel, Alberta. And the report was actually released, published by the Canadian Forces, and is an analysis of, the depth of the rings impressed into the ground, their dimensions, and the interviews with people who had been there. They tested it for radiation. There was no radiation found. But there are many, many cases that are included in these files, and this particular one, because it really predates crop circles by many, many years, it shows that it's a phenomenon that's been around and with us for a very long time and investigated at high level, showing a very high level of interest. And for me, this is one of the most interesting things, that in the case of Falcon Lake, and I was actually speaking with one of the original investigators just a few days ago. Just imagine the man hours that was spent on investigating these cases. We're talking of the order of probably a few hundred man hours investigating cases, many expenses that were used in investigation at a military and police level. Mm-hmm. Helicopters were used as troop transports to investigate the cases. And we find this in case after case after case in Canada to show an official interest in this. Now, this, of course, was Cold War. So, there was a strong interest in trying to understand what was being seen and what was being experienced, and is there any evidence, and trying to analyze the evidence. And I'm sure that the Canadians were sharing a lot of this information with the United States, certainly because in the case of Falcon Lake, Roy Craig with the Conan Report and Conan Committee was brought in to investigate as well. So I'm sure that a lot of this information was shared at a very high level and probably continued to be shared even after Blue Book was closed in 1969. So I think there has been a high level of official interest by the United States working with its allies, and that probably continues today. And we know for a fact it continued until at least 1995, and I suspect beyond that.
Out of everything that you've seen, not only through the government documents that you've researched, but obviously you have collected thousands and thousands of cases, spoke to witnesses, just bottom line question, is this an alien phenomena or phenomenon?
As I have to put on my silly scientist hat and say, no, I don't see anything that proves this beyond a shadow of a doubt. What we can say, though, there's evidence that there's a real phenomenon that's been taken seriously by official investigators that shows that that there's something that the scientific community should be taking a closer look at itself. Now, certainly many cases can be explained, and we know the limitations of witnesses, and we know the limitations of time and so forth. But there's no question that there's a real phenomenon that needs a look at. I've sometimes said, if there really isn't a physical phenomenon, then at the very least, there's a sociological or a psychological phenomenon. And in any one of those cases, it should be studied by science. And it should be studied scientifically and methodologically so that we can give a better understanding and gain a better understanding of what is being seen by the literal thousands and thousands of witnesses. Polls have shown that 10% of the North American population believe they've seen UFOs. In Canada, that's of the order of 35 million people. In the United States, it's a factor of 10. So 35 million people in the population, so 3.5 million, so a factor of 10, 35 million people in the United States believe they've seen UFOs. That's a significant number, even just based on the polls, regardless of what they're seeing, and that suggests that there's something worthy of study.
Obviously, the last year has been fairly exciting in the field of UFOs. Lots of new revelations. Obviously, here in America, there was a revelation of what they called a secret Pentagon UFO study. Were you surprised when these headlines flew around the world? Was it not surprising to you? What were your thoughts when this broke back in December of 2017?
Well, I have to say I wasn't too surprised because, in the years that the investigation was going on, 2005 to 2007, I had actually I've been contacted by Robert Bigelow during that time for assistance in getting access to some Canadian UFO reports. So I knew that some of this was going on, and I'd continued to hear back from some of his assistants in the years that followed. At the same time, because I know that I'd been receiving UFO reports through official channels throughout that period too, I knew that something was being done, and some investigations were being done somewhere and somehow, and I knew that the cases continued to roll in. So it's not surprising that there was an interest. Whether that amounted to serious Pentagon interest or something more involved with business ventures, and whether it was financed by government money or through public money or through private money, I'm not sure. But I wasn't too surprised. I'm still curious as to what is eventually going to be revealed. I know that privately there's an invisible college of scientists who are fascinated with the phenomena. I know that in my own involvement with various universities, I've ended up having long conversations with astronomers, psychologists, and individuals from a number of different fields who are fascinated with the UFO phenomenon, but have been frustrated with the lack of really good data and really good information that's available. And one of the reasons I produced the Canadian UFO Survey is to try and liaise with scientists who are curious and trying to understand what it is that's really being seen and experienced by witnesses looking for the real data. And hopefully, it'll contribute someday to a better understanding of the phenomenon.
I think it's already contributing. It is an amazing resource. Again, for those who want to check it out, it's survey.canadianUFOreport.com. Now, Chris, you said something interesting a couple moments ago, and I want to kind of clarify it to make sure I heard it right. Are you saying that when the Canadian government was giving you these reports, you kind of felt like something was going on, that there was an additional layer of investigation? Were you seeing evidence of that in these records?
No, this was it was more intuition, but at the same time, I mentioned the case of the airline pilots flying between Ottawa and Toronto just a few years ago, where there was some investigation going on at some particular level that I wasn't privy to. So I suspect that some really good cases are being investigated through Transport Canada, in the same sense that airline crashes are handled through Transport Canada and official organizations. Transport Canada, of course, is the Canadian equivalent of the FAA. Mm-hmm. So certainly a lot of that investigation is being done, and not all of it is completely available, but you can certainly get access to some of it.
And today, with kind of the shift in coverage, I know some argue a bigger shift than others, but I mean, obviously there's a little bit of a shift in the last year of coverage, and that it's seemingly news agencies, at least here in America, seem to take UFO reports a little bit more seriously. With the Invisible College that you referenced, do you feel that we are shifting towards this Invisible College being not so invisible, or do you think we're just kind of putting along at the same pace we have been for decades, and they're not going to be in the limelight at all?
Well, I agree. It's not particularly invisible. I have been advising some individuals who are doing their doctoral theses on the subject of UFOs, and there's a few coming out in the next few years, I think, when they finally completed. So I think there's a lot of interest. In fact, I think there's of the order of 200 or 300 master's and doctoral theses on the subject of UFOs that are available right now. So it's not particularly invisible, really. But in terms of media coverage, I have to say that in all the years that we've been doing the Canadian UFO survey, I would say that the vast majority of media coverage has been positive. Mm-hmm. In fact, very little ridicule. I would say in any particular year, perhaps 10% has been flippant. The rest play it fairly straight. And I think media recognize that when we're not talking in terms of, tinfoil hats and silly stuff, that, there's serious work being done. And if you're not making any claims about, the 76 varieties of aliens and so forth that might exist in our universe, that, I think people are fascinated with the subject itself and think about the possibilities that are out there that aliens could be existing. My astronomy background allows the fact that, there's probably aliens out there. It's just the vast distances that cause the problems in terms of traveling. But I think that given an advanced civilization, not that the laws of physics can be broken, but they might be bent in ways that we simply can't envision right now. And it might be possible for a civilization 100,000 years more advanced than us might be able to travel between the stars in ways that we simply don't know yet.
That's a show in itself. I love topics like that on how you view space travel. And of course, with 21st century science, you can only explain a certain amount of things and say rules can't be broken. I'd play devil's advocate and say probably every rule is broken when you talk about, a civilization that's got 100,000 or 500,000 or even 1 million year head start. But again, that's a completely different show in itself. What is next, in your opinion, for the field of ufology as we kind of move forward and you're collecting data? And I'm glad to hear, by the way, that the majority of publicity and news coverage when it comes to the Canadian UFO survey has been positive. And I think that's a true testament to the hardcore data that you've been collecting and the hard work that you've been undertaking here in the last X amount of years, where you've worked hard, you've collected this data. You can't take jabs at that. You can't make fun of it. But there are those out there that are making wild, extraordinary claims and don't back anything up. And I feel that kind of stuff really does hold us back from taking that next step. So what, as a field, if you were the leader of the UFO field, what would be next? What do we need to do, and where should we be going?
Well, this reminds me of after the passing of Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Alan and I chatted a little bit about this, and who speaks for ufology now, really? And I don't know. But in terms of where ufology is going, yeah, it's true that people are making some really extraordinary claims about everything from downloading information into your brain from distant galaxies to whether certain pieces of dirt picked up on a grassy field or in a parking lot might have something to do with alien civilization and metamaterials. I'm glad to see that there are some scientists now coming forward, and regardless of their reputations, are starting to speak out a little bit more and get more involved. But it's data that we need, and where it comes from is a big problem. The Canadian UFO Survey is interesting, but I'm one of its worst critics. I mean, it certainly has its limitations. It was done over a series of years, and a number of people have assisted me in entering the data. A number of people have had eyes on it, sorting through it. There are cases that have been missed. There are cases that have come to light after, for example, a case this year or a case a number of years ago, from 5 or 6 years ago, just came to light and obviously wasn't included in that particular year's survey. I'd like to go back and do a further analysis of all the cases, the 20,000 cases. I'd like to have them digitized so they're more available for people. There's just a wealth of information out there. And, without the data, you really can't make any definite statements about the nature of the UFO phenomenon. So I think there should be a greater focus on the case information themselves. And through that, we might be able to ask some really good questions. And I think working hand in hand with the skeptics and debunkers, I mean, I don't like the adversarial approach. There's, lots of anecdotes about Hynek and class getting together for beers and that type of thing. I'd like to see a better relationship between the skeptics and the debunkers and the pro-UFO crowd. I try to remain as neutral as possible. You may know I'm the op for UFO updates, having been given the torch after the passing of Earl Bruce Knapp. I'd like to keep things, the conversation going. I like to keep dialogue going. And the more we can talk about it through vehicles like your podcast that we're on right now, and through other venues, the more we can get to a better understanding of what's really going on. And that was the title of one of my books, or subtitle of one of my books on abductions, was "What's Really Going On?" And I'd like to know.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the skeptics, because that is something that, although a lot of people fight, I think we definitely need in this field, because it keeps people like us who are going after the real data, trying to get answers, on our toes, in the sense that we're not going out on a limb saying, crazy things. They really do bring up questions that we as researchers, investigators, whatever you want to call us, have been called a lot worse, whatever you want to call us, they bring up questions that we need to answer. And so I welcome any of them, Robert Schaefer included, who I actually reached out to a week ago. I've known him for quite some time. I like him. He's got a great sense of humor, and we've lectured at same conferences from time to time, or he's attended. And I've always had a great time. Hopefully he'll come onto the show, and we'll kind of get his point of view on how he approaches the topic as well. But Chris, before we get to the end of the show, I want to ask you about the D word that, although you brought up early in the show, it's kind of been a common question here and topic of discussion when it comes to disclosure. Now, I know you said that the Canadian government, you didn't feel was really engaged in a cover-up, and you didn't feel that it was disclosure in the sense that there was nothing to disclose. At least that's the impression I got from you. But in the broader sense, from a global standpoint, do you believe something like disclosure, where a government is going to come out and say, yes, there is a extraterrestrial presence here? I had Stephen Bassett on the show a couple episodes ago, and I'm sure you know his thoughts on everything. But I want to get your thoughts. Is something like that on the horizon for us?
The short answer is no. I really don't think that there is a government or a group like the Bilderbergs or whoever who are pulling the strings. I've heard the term puppet master tossed around lots of times, and whether that's the president of the United States or president of some other country or a prime minister here or somebody in charge of a large corporation, I don't buy into that. And part of that is that if we had the technology, and yes, you might want to leak it out slowly so that people won't panic and so forth if you really had that. But I suspect, what was true back in the 50s and 60s is that the government really didn't know any more about UFOs than the civilians did, but they're making it look as if they did. Mm-hmm. I don't see any concerted effort. I don't see the fact that Britain's Ministry of Defense was releasing UFO reports at a rapid rate. The Canadian Archives has been digitizing and making its reports that were always available more available. And I don't see, using films to prepare the public, any indication. In fact, you can look at the Canadian UFO Survey 30-year data and see how the number of reports relates to the release of TV shows like The X-Files and movies and things like that. And there really is no significant correlation there that I've been able to determine. So I don't think we're being prepared. I think that if we are finding out more and more about UFOs and Pentagon studies and so forth, it's the natural order. It's what happens when good research is being done over the course of many years. And I don't think personally that there's going to be a revelation that tomorrow that that we actually have the aliens on ice and they've been in pickle jars or working in a secret underground base in Roswell or wherever for some time. I find it unlikely. Do I think that there's information out there that suggests that aliens could be trying to contact us through whatever means, through radio signals? I find that difficult to believe as well, because radio signals are intercepted by amateur radio operators and amateur astronomers as well as the military. So if there's something coming from outer space, we'd know about it. Mm-hmm. So I suspect not, but let me put it this way. I'm willing to be surprised.
Well, I hope we're all surprised. We have been talking to Chris Rutkowski, author of 10 published UFO and related books, most recently When They Appeared, where he dissects the Falcon Lake case that we talked briefly about just minutes ago. When They Appeared, published in 2017. Check out his blog. There is a ton of material to read going back many, many years. You can do so at uforum.blogspot.com. And all of that data that he's collected in the Canadian UFO Survey, check out survey.canadianuforeport.com. And if you've missed any of those links or want one central resource on everything that we've talked about, check out the show notes page at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. That will break down everything that Chris and I talked about, including links on how to purchase all of his books, his blog, website, Canadian UFO Survey, and much, much more. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak to all of us and telling us what's going on in Canada. I really do appreciate your time.
Thanks, John.
Although that concludes my interview with Chris Rutkowski, don't go away. The new TBV Update segment is coming up. We welcome back Mr. Christopher O'Brien to talk about a brand new high-tech project that could revolutionize UFO research. That's next on TBV Updates. On this episode's TBV Updates segment, this is the first one in hopefully a long line of TBV Updates. This is a segment where I go back into the archives, bring a previous guest onto the show to update us on something that they may have alluded to or talked to or hinted at, or maybe just a project they started. Bring them back, have them update us all about what is going on. In this particular episode, I am stretching back all the way to episode number 7. Mr. Christopher O'Brien, my friend who joined me to speak about all things animal mutilations, or at least mostly in that episode, has started a project that is pretty amazing. I mean, it really does look like this will revolutionize UFO research and this field in general. So, Christopher O'Brien, thank you so much for coming back and updating us on what you're doing.
Hey, anytime I can dive into that black vault of yours, man, it's a pleasure and an honor. Thanks, John.
Well, thank you. And you've been posting quite a bit about this on your social media, about the UFO Data Acquisition Project. Tell everybody, what exactly is that?
Well, it's in a nutshell, essentially what we're doing is we're taking the wonderful, affordable technology that we now have in this 21st century and scientific diagnostic technology and detection technology. And what we're doing is creating packages of triangulated arrays that can be set up by anyone in their neighborhood in an effort to triangulate and capture real-time ufological events. And, you know, when I first kind of thought about trying to do this 20 plus years ago, I did a feasibility study on it, and it would have cost, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And now with, the wonderful levels of technology and the affordability just becoming really just breathtakingly, this kind of gear is now breathtakingly accessible for the average person. We're able now to do, for about $2,500, we're able to set up a system with, let's say, 2 cameras and one of our, we call them an MSDAU unit, which is a multi-sensor data acquisition unit. We're able to set up a system like this, like I said, for about $2,500. Now, what we're talking about is a high-definition pan, tilt, zoom camera inside an environmentally secure dome, which would be good up to 120 degrees and down to 20 below. This 2 cameras and a multi-sensor unit. The multi-sensor unit is 8 inches square, maybe a little bit larger, 9 inches, and it's based on a Raspberry Pi system. It's written in an open source language, Python, and what it has is like a poor man's magnetometer, a compass, and it has an accelerometer, a gravitometer, and it has the ability to plug in other instrumentation as well. Like if you wanted to put a tri-field meter, if you wanted to do other types of, let's say, acoustic PZM mics to get extremely low frequency recordings, you can plug these in and record data when an event occurs. And what makes this system especially exciting is that our engineer, Ron Olch, is very, very talented ex-Disney computer scientist, long-time UFO aficionado, and someone who's been developing detection software for many years. Very, very fortunate to have him on the team. And what he's done is he's designed and created software which allows the cameras to talk to each other and the sensor units to talk to each other over the internet. So if we have, let's say, an event go by and you have 2 cameras several miles apart and one of these MSDAU units, when that event occurs, the system is alerted. Emails are immediately sent to you, and then in real time, the cameras are given coordinate data over the internet so that they can wheel around, pan, tilt, and zoom into the actual object of the event. And then, with the help of GPS, you're then able to place the actual event on a map. Think about distance, altitude, azimuth, speed, size, various optical and physical, XY axis information. But then with the magnetometer and the gravimeters and the other sensing equipment, you're able to also detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field and the Earth's gravitational field. And all this is done on autopilot. And we have a GUI, a graphic user interface, that allows the the real-time operation of the camera. But then it's also an autopilot situation where this type of ufological event would be automatically monitored and recorded, to an external hard drive, let's say, or into the cloud. And so you literally have an autonomous system that is able to detect and document scientifically. Most importantly, I'll say that word again, scientifically, document a real-time UFO event. This has never really been done before, to my knowledge.
Well,
the Project Hasdal and is probably the closest.
I've never heard of anything this elaborate. It's amazing to hear the details and the lengths that you've gone to and that your team has gone to create such a research angle. I mean, again, I'm kind of surprised we haven't heard about this in the past, that people haven't tried to do something.
You too, huh?
Yeah, and it's great and very refreshing to hear that somebody is going after data versus just kind of making stuff up as they go. Let me tell all of the listeners. Now, you've created a GoFundMe campaign raising some money to go. And fund this project and get more cameras out there. For those that are interested, I highly recommend supporting Christopher on this. If you go to www.gofundme.com/UFODAP-SLV, you will get all of the details on this project, and obviously that is how you can donate and support this project, which, hearing about it, is fairly amazing. And I want to add, so the listeners understand, this is not something that you're planning on doing in the future. This is something that you are doing as we update everybody, that even though you're still doing this GoFundMe campaign, and again, the funds are very deserved, that they should come your way to do this, you're already doing it. And I want to give props to that, because you're not just trying to collect everybody's money and then maybe like 3 years from now you'll do something, which sadly we see quite a bit in this field.
Yeah,
you are
especially in the free energy device department.
Yeah, and a lot of those campaigns just become so silly because they'll raise thousands and thousands of dollars, and then all of a sudden, like the person that did the campaign, you never hear from them. And I really want to stress that to the listeners, that there is photographic evidence that Christopher O'Brien is out there in the field already setting stuff up, and your funds can help expand that project. So I want to point that out for everybody. Let me ask you, on this project, are other people able to contribute and not only financially but contribute and get the camera system and set it up wherever their neck of the woods are, or are you just kind of creating the network yourself?
Well, a combination of both. Like I said, the affordability makes this an accessible approach for anyone in ufology who feels that they live in a place that would warrant this type of equipment. What we're doing with the GoFundMe campaign is we're trying to get ahead of ourselves in terms of having these devices in stock. So what we're doing is we're coming up with a price list. We're coming up with a way, a package, different levels of packages from entry level to mid level, like what we're installing in the San Luis Valley. We've actually installed our first two cameras in the valley. One of the cameras is on a cell tower. One of them is right ground, front row center, ground zero, one of the hottest locales of UFOs, documented UFO sightings in the world. And so we already now have two cameras up. We're doing the final tweaking of triangulation software and getting our signals port forwarded up to our server in Denver. But what makes this exciting, John, is this is just the beginning. What we're going to do is we're going to offer these systems, like I said, to people around the country, and eventually, I would hope, around the world. We've already gotten interest from Australia, Switzerland, Italy, a number of states. MUFON chapters are very interested, Washington, New York. This ideally could create a nodal system of detection units around the world in hotspot areas. And all this data can be gathered into a single place. I mean, you'll be able to obviously record your own data, but because of the wonderful internet, we're able to literally have all this data go to a centralized point where it can then be properly analyzed. And, if this continues in the direction and with the type of attention to detail that we're planning on putting into this project, ideally, I mean, we could literally have the kind of irrefutable, unassailable data that would allow for the writing of a scientific paper. Let's say, get someone like a Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist, to look at the data, and if we're able to get 2 or 3 events going, and we have data that we can bounce off one event's data off another, sky's the limit. I mean, we literally could be talking academia, the scientific community, becoming forced to become involved in this, because once you get the kind of data that they've been saying, well, you don't have repeatability, there's you don't have any sort of data that we can sink our teeth into. Once you supply them with that, then it's a whole new ball game. Mm-hmm. And so yes, we have these systems available for people. And the GoFundMe campaign is going to allow Ron, our engineer, and possibly the addition of another engineer to start manufacturing these multi-sensor data acquisition units. And the system is designed so you don't even need a camera. You could set up one of the multi-sensor arrays. You could set up cameras without the multi-sensor array, or you can set up cameras and the array. It's designed so that any combination of those cameras and data acquisition units, any combination can be used to gather data. In the San Luis Valley, as many of your listeners who are aware of my work know, I spent the better part of 13 years there. I literally put 300,000 miles on a truck in 6 years, running around investigating cases. And this particular location, I obviously I felt was a very good place to set up the first units. But there's Mount Shasta, Mount Adams in Washington, and California, White Sands in New Mexico, the Mojave, Pine Bush in New York, the Zone of Silence in Sonora, the M Triangle in Russia. I mean, there are so many places that if you set one of these systems up, I would almost be willing to go to Vegas and bet that at some point you are going to be able to not only get actual events recorded and have the data gathered, but repeat that and actually have multiple events. So this, again, I just can't. I'm giddy with excitement that we've finally gotten this. It's been really a 10-year project that we've been working on this, and it's been, we've had lots of fits and starts and false starts and problems with bandwidth and other things. But now with the internet really spreading around, and you see more and more rural areas have high-speed internet now. That's one of the main stumbling blocks that we've really been dealing with. Now that we do have the wonderful spread of the internet, high-speed internet around, that particular stumbling block is becoming less and less of a hindrance and a barrier to conducting good science. Yeah.
And it sounds like this is good science, and kudos again to you and your team for putting it together. The last thing that I want to ask you for this TBV update segment, and then I'll let you go, is about the software itself. Now, for those listening, if you missed that link, it's gofundme.com/UFODAP-SLV. And don't worry, everything is going to be linked into the show notes page. If you go to www.theblackvault.com/show notes, I'll go ahead and give direct links to the GoFundMe campaign and more details. Even add some photographs that Chris has been adding and showing his work in the field, which is pretty amazing to see this thing come together. My question, though, one of the last questions I have is about the software itself, which that in itself, right, just excluding all other aspects of it, is pretty impressive. You put a YouTube video link of an example of how the software works of something flying in the sky. What I want to ask you is just a little bit more detail about how the software works. Is it only motion, and if a helicopter goes by, it's maybe a false positive? Does it have ability to kind of narrow down what the important clips are? How does that work?
Well, yeah, to get into some of the finer details, we are in the midst. That's what this particular first installation of gear is going to do. Is it's going to allow us to do things like mask out known light sources, for instance, so that we don't have any possibility of false positives with actual lights, let's say at night in an area. We're also going to be figuring out the algorithms that we need that would then enable the triggering of the record on motion software. Essentially what we're looking for is non-ballistic motion. So if something is zipping across the sky, too quickly to be an airplane, too far away to be, let's say, a bird, an insect, that sort of thing. Because we're dealing with multiple cameras, obviously if an event occurs and all the cameras can see the event, then it's going to be something that's worthy of noticing. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a development curve on exactly how we're going to be taking the potential of false positives out of the equation. Obviously, that's going to be what we're going to be working on next in terms of having the system up and working out the algorithms for that. But all this has been carefully thought out. That is an important aspect of the project, is to try to keep the whole idea of getting woken up by an email alarm.
Yeah.
For a bird flying by or something. Obviously, we want to eliminate the possibility of that. People have asked some pretty interesting questions, like, well, what happens if you have multiple objects, for instance? There are ways to deal with that. I mean, I think a primary object would be probably the one that the initial camera that detected it would select that object, and then it would have to be, I guess some sort of algorithm would go in there to, instead of zooming the second and third cameras in, maybe they would go to a wide angle in the case of multiple objects, so you're not going to be losing any sort of part of an aspect of the event as it unfolds. So yeah, that's a good question. That's obviously going to be a major part of the development curve in making sure that not only are we recording something on motion, but making sure that what we're recording isn't a waste of time.
Yeah.
Another aspect too that we're going to be doing is using all sky cams. There's very good digital all sky cams, and for people who don't know what one of those is, it's a camera with a fisheye lens that gives you a complete 360-degree view of the environment. And in the case of the San Luis Valley, we have unfettered visual access, 360 degrees. So an all sky cam is going to be giving you the entire sky. If an event occurs on that all sky cam, it's going to be much easier for the system to be alerted and have that proximity data sent from the all sky camera to the other cameras. So, we're working on various ways to detect motion, and once we do detect motion that meets the criteria of a real anomalous event, then everything will really move quickly. We'll go into record. And the tracking software is pretty interesting. It's like a poor man's targeting software. The video you mentioned, it shows you we have two bounding boxes, which are boxes like targeting boxes in a heads-up display in a fighter jet, let's say. This is kind of like poor man's targeting software, mm-hmm. and which may be a little difficult to get an export license for. We're going to have to kind of deal with that issue when people in other countries start requesting the gear. That's a whole other issue. But basically what you have is an outer bounding box that keeps the event in the center of the screen. And then you have an inner bounding box that then allows the camera to zoom in on the event. So if you go to GoFundMe.com/UA, I don't even know my own.
No, that's
address.
okay. It's GoFundMe.com/UFO-SLV.
Yeah, if you go there, there's a video that shows a plane taking off from Bob Hope Airport, just to give an example of how the actual bounding boxes and the targeting software performs. When we record an event, we're also going to be recording the event without all the metadata and bounding boxes, so you have a pristine image as well. Again, this is really, we're kind of inventing the wheel a little bit here, and we do, obviously we're going to have some hurdles to work out the details and get the finer points dealt with in terms of proper identification of anomalous events and that sort of thing, in fact, false positives. But once we do that, we're going to make these systems available for anybody. We're finishing up a user guide for the system, so your graphic user interface will be turnkey. When you get it, it'll be very, very simple and easy for the average person to get this thing up and running. The software has already been created. We just have to go ahead and get the software fine-tuned.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. We've been talking to Christopher O'Brien about his new UFO data acquisition project, or UFO DAP. You can support his work by going to www.gofundme.com/UFODAP-SLV. And if you have not done so already, I invite you to go back to the Black Vault Radio episode number 7, where Chris and I really dive deep into his work on animal mutilations. He has done a lot of research in his day and is one of the very few that I highly respect in the field. And it is this UFO data acquisition project that serves as one of the many reasons on why I say that, because this is very impressive. I recommend you all to check it out. Chris, thank you so much for updating us all. You are welcome back anytime. I'm really eger to see how this comes out for you. But honestly, good luck with it, and I'll definitely be watching.
We live in exciting times, and I've often said, don't call me a ufologist, and I guess I'm being pulled into the field kicking and screaming, whether I like it or not. Somebody was bound to do this. I'm just glad that the team that I am so proud to be associated with is pulling this whole field kicking and screaming into the future.
Well, good. Well, we've all been called worse than ufologists, so things could be things could be worse. But I do hear you, and honestly, thanks again. Good luck with everything, and we'll definitely bring you back again soon and see how those systems are working out for you. See what you've captured.
Okay, super. Thanks, John.
Thank you. The show's not over yet. Coming up, I have an update on a previous TBV Unredacted segment. And the strange story I told back in episode number 10 just got a whole lot more bizarre. That's next on TBV Unredacted. In this episode's TBV Unredacted, I am following the theme of the updates. Obviously, we're just coming off of the re-interview of Christopher O'Brien coming back to the show and talking about his new project. Very, very cool. I do recommend, like I had mentioned during that segment, to check that out. But just by chance, the day that I recorded these interviews, put the show together, and was choosing the document that I was going to profile in this segment. This is your first time listening. TBV Unredacted is the time in the show where I pick a document either at random or sometimes with the theme of the show, or, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll grab a document and then just kind of profile it here because a lot gets lost. I mentioned that in the beginning of the show as well. Now, just by chance, I got an envelope. I get mail every day from the government, but I got a somewhat thicker envelope, not too thick, from the National Security Agency today. Now, I'm always excited to hear from the big agencies like the CIA and the NSA. Of course, everything that I go after I feel is of interest. But these bigger agencies, obviously, they're more they're more interesting just in the sense of what they do, how they operate, and obviously what I request to them. Some agencies I request a lot more from. The NSA is definitely top of the list. They don't like me very much, probably for that reason, but that's how it is. And so I got this envelope today, and I always just try and peek into the bigger envelopes. Obviously, I get a stack of what they call interim responses, which is just confirming requests. So I get a lot of those normal envelopes, and I don't normally rip those open incredibly quick, but the bigger ones I do. So I opened this thing, and it was from the National Security Agency. Let me go ahead and grab it here. All right, so it's in my hand. And so the very cover of the letter, I've learned just by the amount of mail that I get from the NSA, they have two types of envelopes, at least by the time of this recording, they do. Generally, the normal Freedom of Information Act office is a normal manila envelope color. And then ones that are involving a mandatory declassification review are a different, much lighter color. Now, again, that's kind of a silly detail, but it's a detail nonetheless where it then cues me to say, hey, this is probably a little bit more interesting because this is the result of a mandatory declassification review. I opened it up. It's about, at rough estimate, about 20 pages that I pull out of this thing. The very top is what's called a transmittal of material. Now, this is a transmittal slip. This means that they are cueing those that are putting this in the envelope, that the information that they are sending me is unclassified. Now, if I did have a classification clearance, so let's say a top secret clearance or secret clearance, and they were transmitting me top secret material, then that transmittal slip would say as such. This particular one is unclassified. These are fairly normal to see generally when you start getting documents that have never been out before. They don't come with every Freedom of Information Act request letter that you get, but when you do get them, again, it kind of leans towards the, hey, this is going to be a little bit more interesting. So I go to the next page, and sure enough, this is a result of the mandatory declassification review that I filed on the 18 or at least 18 pages of top secret material on Mother Teresa. Now, back in a previous episode, I believe it was episode number 10, that was when I interviewed Nate Jones, the director of the National Security Archive, so only a few episodes ago, not too long. In the TBV Unredacted segment, I talked about the original letter that came from the NSA when I filed for records on Mother Teresa. Just to refresh your memory, the NSA told me that every page of what they found on Mother Teresa was actually classified top secret and exempt from release. Now, that was back in 2015. Now, fast forward to this year in 2018. I filed a mandatory declassification review on those specific records. Now, you've heard me talk about this before. For those that are interested in using the FOIA, there is a very, I would say, underused by FOIA requesters, even by myself, for many years. And just by chance, in the Nate Jones interview, I talk about appeals and mandatory declassification reviews that it took me many years to get the confidence to start utilizing. And once I did, I realized, hey, this can actually be really productive. I was getting big wins, not only with FOIA appeals, but then going after documents that were previously denied to me by filing a mandatory declassification review or MDR request, asking for that information to be reviewed. I put up a case that says, hey, this should be declassified for XYZ. Sometimes that's a little bit easier depending upon the case and documents that you're going after. But with Mother Teresa, I pretty much put out the case like, hey, look, she's passed away. It's Mother Teresa. I doubt there's anything super secretive about her, but I could be wrong, And so I just kind of put up a case. And sure enough, they released these pages. So here they are in my hand. I've got them online. You go to the show notes page, link them while I talk about them here, www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Now, in this release was all 18 pages that they previously said were classified top secret. So I was pretty excited when I read that letter. I was like, great, these are the finally, they're releasing them. These are the records that were previously denied to me. So I start thumbing through the pages. Each and every last one, with the exception of one paragraph, is completely blacked out. So I won the mandatory declassification review. I got them to release it. Problem is, everything is still classified, with the exception of one paragraph. And since it's not long, I'm going to read it to you. I don't read a lot of documents on the air, but I feel that this one is short enough to read. Now, in the 18 pages, as I said, everything is redacted with the exception of this paragraph. Everything is cited with two exemptions. One is called B1. That is all national security related information, so that's your top secret stuff. B3 is going to be redacted by what they call a statute, or that there's a public law in this particular case that allows them to stop the release of information. Specifically, this is called Public Law 8636, or part of the United States Code 3605 out of Chapter 50. And I know that that's all Greek even to me, but just to be as accurate as possible, that's what these exemptions are. Now, in the letter, they also state that B6 applies, which is privacy information. So obviously there's some names and everything in here. But and I'm going to appeal this. I'm going to say that up front, because I do not believe that their redactions properly reflect their letter. So I do not believe that they did this proper, and so I am going to appeal it. But they did redact everything. In addition to those exemptions, again, top secret, personal information, exempted by statute and that public law, there's non-responsive information. So these are probably intelligence reports and documents wherein they probably talk about a multitude of issues, and Mother Teresa was only a part of all of that in the record. And so what they do is they black out some of the non-responsive stuff that does not pertain to my request, kind of expedites everything, makes it a little quicker, but also allows me to get the information that I requested versus them reviewing all the stuff that I didn't necessarily request. Now, also, for the record, I'm going to file another request for that non-responsive information because, honestly, I'm interested in everything. I really don't have a lack of interest when it comes to intelligence records and documents, because even though it might not deal with Mother Teresa, there might be something about Iraq or Iran or another country that is of interest. So I'm going to be going after that information. Now, back to that paragraph that they did release. I'm going to read it here. This is a quote. According to press, in parentheses unclassified, the, quote, peace boat, unquote, registered under the name IBN Khaldoon, was to leave Algiers on 5 December, en route to Iraq, to deliver milk and medicine to Iraq's children. The boat was to make calls at several ports along the route. The mission was being conducted at the initiative of the Conference of Arab Women favoring Iraq. Approximately 300 women were to travel on the boat, including Mother Teresa. And that's it. That's all that they released. There's not even a year in there. Obviously, it says 5 December. There's not even a year. I'm sure we could probably deduce it just by doing a little bit of research and where Mother Teresa was and traveled. And maybe that's an easy point. But since I just got this, I haven't really looked into it at all, other than I wanted to bring this to you as the document profiled on this episode's TBV Unredacted. Because, again, it is an update on that episode 10 TBV Unredacted segment where I brought up that original letter. Now I finally got the release of the documents, and they're completely classified still. So my question, as I leave this to you now to try and figure out what could they be hiding, is just that. What is so classified about Mother Teresa? Now, maybe in a future episode, I'll highlight some others where we find out some people, some celebrities that we kind of know and love for being who they are in their public persona, had essentially secret identities in the past and working for the government, working for intelligence agencies. I'll throw one out there but not really explain it much because I'll probably use it in the future, and that's Julia Child. Julia Child had a very secretive other life other than what you know her as the on-camera chef celebrity that we all, loved growing up and watching, and obviously became very much a household name. So was Mother Teresa some type of informant? Was she an agent? Was she not who we thought she was? Was she involved in something? Was there something that involved her and she didn't know it? Who knows? There's 1,000, even more than that, different reasons why these records would still remain top secret. I don't understand it. I can't figure it out. I've tried to look back in 2015 when I first originally got the denial, started researching her life a little bit. What could this connect to? Why would the national security have a short stack of information? I'm not going to say this is voluminous compared to some of the other responses that I've received. So it's not a ton of information, but obviously whatever is dealing with her, specifically her, is classified secret. Now, let me go ahead and dispel a myth before I let you go. You might think, because these are intelligence documents that I referenced before, and there's other non-responsive information that's redacted, that possibly the top secret information is dealing with something not even related to Mother Teresa, but she's in the documents and therefore exempt. Here is the rebuttal that I will leave you with. That can't be true. This is explained easily by the fact that when they review a document, you can declassify those other paragraphs that aren't particularly classified, but leave the classified paragraphs just that, classified. Every paragraph has a stipulation or classification stipulation in the very beginning of the paragraph. Not every document has this, but most do, where you have a letter in parentheses, U meaning unclassified, S meaning secret, TS meaning top secret. And so every paragraph in an intelligence report has that designation in the very beginning. That cues any reviewer or anybody who's reviewing it or possibly in the process of declassifying it, that particular paragraph, even though it's, top secret, they'll still review it, but that does cue them that, hey, this is a top secret paragraph. This is what gets the top secret stamp on it. If that was the case, and Mother Teresa's information in these top secret documents was unclassified, that actually would be released. That's indicative by that paragraph that I read to you, that even though it was classified and exempt from release in 2015, here I am looking at it in 2018, and it's because I filed that MDR, and they determined that one paragraph could be declassified, but everything else remains classified top secret. That's where I am going to leave it with you. Feel free to post comments, generate some social media interest in this, because I think it's important. These types of things are fairly fascinating. So make sure you reference that. Feel free to link over to the podcast, the radio show, the YouTube channel, however you want to subscribe. You can do so at www.theblackvault.com/show notes. That will give you all of the links that I'm talking about and that we've talked about this entire episode. This was quite a beefy episode with a couple different interviews, quite a few different segments, and obviously this one. Feel free to subscribe to the show, share the links, and post what you think, because I'm really curious if I'm missing something and it is known that she was involved in some kind of top secret operation. Who knows? Thank you all, as always, for listening and tuning in, making the Black Vault Radio your podcast of choice for at least the last couple of hours anyway. This is John Greenewald Jr. signing off. We'll see you next time.